Hey everyone, and welcome to my intro for Substance for Environment Art. So I'm going to obviously sign up for the course in this image here. So I'm going to give you a quick to start with. I'm going to give you a very quick sort of overview of myself in the industry and how I got started, the sort of path I took into where I am now, sort of my studies and how I learned what I learned, and then I'll give a sort of basic overview of what the course is going to cover itself, and then we'll move on to actually getting started with the programs, their UI, and sort of the first kind of steps if you're going to make something in Substance. Okay, so obviously, yep, that's the name of the course. So, and that's me, obviously. So, yeah. So, sort of first things first. So, it's a bit about my background. So, I went to school and studied art and design. So, I had quite a traditional, you know, art background, and that was it was always obvious to me from the very start. Like, this is what I'm going to be doing. Like, I just knew that that was what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure so much like how to actually like turn that into a career. So the first kind of thing I did was when I sort of left school and college and things was think, well, how am I actually gonna, what am I gonna do to make this into an actual career? So yeah, the first thing I did was go to a load of universities and have a look at different courses and things like that. Um, so I very quickly got into sort of looking at the art kind of courses, and the first thing that kind of grabbed my attention was sort of foundation art degree. So I jumped straight on that. Went to Leicester, um, to Montfort University to do that. So that was really good. It was like sort of a lot more traditional. So it's like painting and drawing, sculpture, and all that kind of things. Lots of really interesting workshops with like glass and things like that, so that they could actually, kind of just give you an intro to all the different kind of areas of art itself. So when I was doing that, I kind of went down a path of kind of graphics and illustration, and that's when you sort of like could specialize in that. So straight away I was like, yes, okay, that's what I want to do. I was looking at graphics and illustration courses and in various universities, and then kind of stumbled. I was sort of talking to one of my friends at the time, and he said, "Oh, okay, well, I'm going to like do this sort of game course." I was like, "Okay, that's cool. I like games. Go and have a like just sort of like a bit on a whim, really. Let's go and have a look at that." So yeah, I went to have a look, and then decided in the end actually to change from doing graphics illustration into games. So the course was really interesting, and I wasn't really sure that much about it, but I went and had a look and found out about it, and then that's basically what I did my degree in. So it was a game art course, and then I sort of you could so the way that the course worked was it was split like half traditional, half sort of 3D. So you doing painting and drawing, so you're learning like sort of fundamental basics for sort of concept art and all that kind of stuff, as well as learning the 3D side of things. So I hadn't really ever touched like I'd done a bit of CAD in the past when I was at school, but I never really touched like much 3D in that sense. So that was kind of a bit of a steep um, learning curve for me. And as soon as I kind of like I was thinking maybe in my second year, what do I want to do? Do I want to do concept art, or do I want to do environments? And I did a big summer of basically just painting a lot and lots of concept art, and got kind of frustrated with it, and wasn't happy like doing that. And so the kind of choice became very obvious to me that I wanted to work in 3D, because it was just it made sense. It was the thing I really enjoyed doing. Like, it didn't stress me out. I was happy doing it. It was satisfying, and yeah, so that was great. Um, and then my last year, I sort of focused like this is what I need to do to get a job. So lots of environment projects, and sort of I think it was about 3 months before the end of my course, I got a phone call actually, because I had a sort of part time job to get a bit of extra money for uni and stuff, and I got a phone call, sorry, while I was at that job, from EA. So that's the picture there, EA in Guildford, and yeah, so I went down for the interview, and yeah, I got a graduate job at EA, which was really really cool. First game working on Need for Speed, so that was really awesome, and I was super happy about that. And yeah, so that was fantastic. Moved down to Guildford and worked there for about a year before the studio sort of shut down and I had to move elsewhere. So then I went to Sony in London, which was like working on VR worlds, which they've sort of just kind of been talking about and announced. So that's really cool. That was an interesting project to work on as well. And then I moved on to CA. So now I'm working on Halo Wars 2. So that's awesome as well. That was a really cool project to be working on, and yeah, so that seems to be getting some very positive stuff around that at the moment. So yeah, that's great. And then just to sort of briefly cover freelance as well, because like I think it's interesting to talk about that sort of stuff as well, because obviously day job's one thing, but when you're doing other things as well, it's kind of an interesting thing to talk about. So yeah, sort of recently with a lot, because I tend to do quite a lot of personal work to keep up to date, and it's just good. I just generally it's very good to do that, because you're always gonna, you never know when you might be looking for a new job, and it's kind of handy to have like stuff that's relevant, up to date, and in fact, like you learn a lot from doing it, and I also really enjoy it. So it's kind of like win-win in a lot of sense, like scenarios. So that's great. But yeah, so basically the freelance stuff's kind of happened upon me, which is really cool, because like when I was at university, I never expected to be in that scenario where I had people come to me to asking me for work. So that's like really like that's amazing. Like that's really great for me. So yeah, I have sort of been doing various stuff sort of for different people and things like that. So that's really nice to have that kind of stuff as well. So now I'm gonna obviously just talk for like 5 minutes. So I want to just show some images now, just because that's a bit more interesting. People can kind of see like the sort of stuff I worked on. So yeah, so this was working on Need for Speed. So this is one of the roads in the game. So when I was working there, I was responsible for like some set dressing and texturing. So I made some textures for roads and things like that while I was there, and some terrain and things like that. So that was cool. It was lots of I also did quite a lot of animation when I first started, which was cool, because I hadn't really touched that much on that kind of stuff, so it was really interesting. They had a sort of section in the game where there was things that would be sort of moving, so you can kind of see the windmills like in the background, that sort of stuff, animating those things in cranes and that sort of stuff, that was a really interesting thing to do, because I had sort of never done anything like that. So that was a good sort of like sort of throw you in the deep end kind of thing. Here's some new stuff to do, and I didn't really know what I was doing, so that was cool. And you'll get that, I think, a lot when you sort of get into the games industry, because you just think, you've got to be quite, like multidisciplined. It's really good to be able to to do those things. So like obviously, practice the thing that you're really good at and get good at that and get a job in it. But it's really good to have a bit of knowledge on other stuff as well, because you just know that way you're going to be like if somebody wants to come and grab you, like they're going to come to you, that's the sort of place you want to be, basically. So yeah, so that's that. And then this is a shot from VR World. So they have like different sort of demos that they kind of released along the way. And yeah, so that's using the Morpheus. So that was a really fun thing to do, because it was quite relevant, like ahead of the time in the industry when I was working on it. So and to be honest, it still is, like the VR stuff's still very like new and interesting, and there's lots of stuff going on. But it was really fun to work on, just because there was something. It was just something different. I hadn't even had that kind of much sort of anything to do with VR, so it was really cool, like something to work on that like nobody else was working on. So that's awesome. So yeah, and then now Halo Wars. So yeah, we've just I suppose I probably could have actually added some stuff from the beta in here, but yeah, so we did a beta after E3, and yeah, it seemed to have gone down really well. So that's great. Just continue working on that at the moment. So that's really cool project to be working on. And when I was at university, Halo was the thing that I wanted to work on. So like getting to that stage in my career is awesome, because like it was kind of like a bucket list type of thing to do, and now I've done it. So that's awesome. And I just got to work out what I want to do next. So yeah, so that's great. Then we'll just move on to personal work now. So this is interesting, because this is a sort of in order, I think. So you'll find like these kind of tie up in relation to the studios that I was at. So I did this when I was at EA. Everybody was all the artists that I was like in the team with were working on Star Wars things, and I was like, oh god, I really want to do something Star Wars. So that was really cool. And I always liked the pod racer scene from the first Star Wars. Like the movie itself was a bit pants, but like, well, in my opinion anyway. But yeah, the um, pod racer scene is like one of the best parts of that movie, and a Sebulba's pod racer was always something that was just like really cool, and the character's a bit like crazy and a bit loopy and interesting, and so yeah, I wanted to kind of do something like PBR. This was like the first time I'd done anything PBR for personal work, and it just was like, oh, this is just such a better way of working. And it was when Substance actually, this was the first kind of I guess like the first introduction for me at least, for Substance really, because like the way I kind of got into this project actually was I I saw a video for Substance Painter, and they had like this tool that was doing sort of like edge wear and burns and things like down, like direct, like a sort of directional thing. So you like for pod racer, that's sort of perfect because when it's traveling, it's getting little bits of stuff hit the kind of sides and burn it, and it's going very fast, obviously in the film. So and a lot of them crash. So that's kind of interesting to imagine what a crashed version of it might be like, and that sort of stuff. Yeah, and then obviously the inspiration for the rest of the scene was some sort of kind of deserty kind of Tatooine kind of style thing. So it was really interesting to kind of, and I'm quite happy with like how I had a lot of like feedback for this and critique and stuff, I think, from Polycount and things like that, and it was really fun to implement that because a lot of it was like to do with to give you like a feeling that the shot was like actually in motion, and I liked that kind of feeling, like to sort of put, I think it's another shot here, just go through that. Yeah, so just do it like, here you go. So obviously there's a bit more dust kick up and particles and sort of like those sort of things, and it was cool because it was like, I don't know, it just gave me a really interesting thing to work on, and yeah, I really enjoyed doing that. So yeah, and it also, I swapped engines sort of halfway through, so I was working in CryEngine, no, sorry, Unreal to start with, and this was just when Unreal 4 came out, and there was a lot of, don't think the vegetation sort of side of things was as good as it is now, and so they've obviously improved that a lot, and whereas CryEngine was a bit more, it's always been quite good for vegetation, so I wanted to put these kind of like little meshes and like, I don't know, cactuses and whatnot in there. So yeah, that was kind of perfect for that. So it was quite interesting to sort of shift everything halfway through project into a different engine. Kind of a good test for sort of like making games anyway, just to see like how it would go. So yeah, that was awesome. So yeah, then this is the sort of next project I did. So yeah, this was a bit more. This was kind of mainly inspired by American Horror Stories because I watched the TV series, and it's kind of like, if you guys have seen it, but basically it's TV show about like people, like there's a different, so every series is like different characters, but they're played by the same actors and actresses, which is really cool. So it's like they obviously very talented that they can kind of jump between all these different roles so easily, but they've kind of pick around like a main theme. So one of them's like a hotel, one of them is like, and they're different, so one's like witches and one's like that kind of thing. So it's like, it's very different, but this was like, there was this sort of an asylum-y kind of one, and this was what I wanted to kind of base this on. And a lot of the plan, like the footprint for the actual layout of this, is like based upon a house that I used to live in. So it was really good because it was like, it gave me like a kind of general layout, and then I just kind of took whatever I wanted to do and make it kind of my own thing. So obviously, like, it wasn't derelict like this, but I found this sort of old school online for reference, which I think is called Lilston Academy or something like that. It's like some sort of girls' school, but it's like really abandoned, like an old abandoned school, and it was just like the perfect reference. So I took that and like a lot of inspiration from that basically, and applied it to the layout of what I already had. And then that kind of just, as you go, like you pick your theme and you kind of just go with that theme, and it gives you those things to make. So like, I was thinking, like when I first laid this out, I've got my sort of walls and a wood floor and bricks, like really basic stuff. But then the whole theme of it then kind of drives what you make as like props and things. So like, I was thinking when I was making this, like I think there's an office scene which is sort of this area. I was kind of thinking that there might be some sort of this might have been a kind of like a school, and this was like the main office in the school. And then the other shot is like the rooms kind of coming off of that like area. So that kind of inspired a lot of that, and obviously it's very like kind of felt like Last of Us, so I took a lot of inspiration from that. Um, so yeah, here's some sort of the props. So like that was kind of um, the desk and the chair and various things that were kind of next to that um, in the actual office itself. And I mean, these things were such good like props to make. Just it was just so like an interesting project because it was all very like the architecture's kind of like Baroque style architecture with like lots of intricate details. And I picked loads of like really kind of complicated props to make, which was just like a really good challenge. And Substance was great for that because like I ended up, so go back to this shot, a lot of these materials like the wood floor and the plaster and all that sort of stuff, those are all made in Designer. And this is kind of, this touches on like what's actually going to kind of be covered in the course, because I like the way I tend to work, in personal work at least anyway, is my tiling textures and all that kind of stuff are always made in Designer, and then anything that's like a prop, like a detailed prop, would be made in Painter. So like going back to this, so these ones are all made in Painter. So like there's a couple of other examples here. But yeah, those are textured in Painter. So that allows me, basically the reason it's done like that is because Painter allows you to do that kind of unique detail per asset basis. So like I can put in the rust and stuff, and you get the control, like you can paint it out and things like that, which is really powerful. And I always found like that was a really good way to work. Whereas if you go back to like say here, the tiling textures, like I want to be able to ensure that they're kind of repeating textures, and obviously there's a lot more kind of stuff going on there because they're vertex painted, so there's there's various plaster details, and the same with the wood, like there's a wet version and then there's a dry version and then there's like a dusty version, and they're all kind of painted in to give different variation. But yeah, the concept's kind of the same. Like you just end up making these tiling textures, which gives you that sort of like, I don't know, it's that kind of like, it gives you the flexibility. Like you can make something tiling, you can make something really interesting, but in Designer that it's always going to tile very easily. That's the power of the program. Like it's very like easy to work with. So yeah, that's great. And then obviously, like I said, with the Painter side of things, like you've got that control. You can say, okay, I want like dust here, and I want a bit of rust on this bit and edge wear and whatever. So yeah, okay. So yeah, that's kind of on that project. And then now it's kind of like looking into the future, basically. So I worked on this, which is for my. So I'm making kind of two. I tend to try and make two scenes at once in a lot of ways, just because it keeps me from getting bored. So like when you're doing something personal work and you're in the industry, it's quite hard to get a good balance. Like, so you'll find like you'll work, like 5 days a week, and then you'll come home. This is even worse actually if you've got like freelance going on as well. But like if you want to do personal work, like you have limited hours in the day, so you might come home and you'd be like, oh man, I've got an evening and it's like 4 hours, and I need to have like food, and I need to do this, I need to like go out, or whatever, like whatever your like other kind of life things are to do. It's like difficult to get that balance. And then the motivation is the main thing, because you're like, oh, I've been working for like 8 hours, and then do you actually want to come home and do that? That's the thing. I think it's quite difficult to get that motivation. So giving myself like 2 projects to do allows me to kind of keep it fresh, because I find like if I work on something for too long, it's not that I get bored of it, it's more that I don't know like how to actually like sort of, it doesn't feel like I'm progressing. Like if I'm giving myself too much to do, and then I don't feel like I've actually, when I look at the project, I've done like one asset, and in the actual terms of like the scene, it doesn't really feel like I've done very much. So I tend to kind of break it down a little bit more, and also give myself a couple of other projects to do at the same time. Allows me to like jump on that one when I get a bit bored of the other one, and go back and change it, whatever. So that's really cool. But yeah, so this is for Guardians of the Galaxy scene that I was doing. So I'm making like the inside of the ship. This is like one of the main assets, like kind of a lot of work in this, because it was sort of main assets, like the chair in the scene. So yeah, and this was all made in Max and then textured in Painter as well. So that was another kind of unique asset done like that. And there's a couple of sort of up close shot of that. I used a bit of Marvelous as well to do the kind of synthetic kind of areas as well. But yeah, so that was really fun to make, like, because it's so detailed and there's just so much to do. And then like sort of in terms of like the second scene I'm doing, this is I'm making a diorama actually, which is like the idea of it is that it's going to be like so like I kind of wanted to do this for a while, because dioramas are one of those things where you can kind of put as much detail into something as you want, which is awesome, because you're like, right, okay, I've got like unlimited like detail here, and because it's a personal project, you're not really, it doesn't matter too much, because like you're just focusing on it looking cool. Like you don't need it to work in for a game really. So like I wanted to pick something like that, and so my scene actually is going to be like, this is the main sort of robot in the scene, which to be honest, I'm going to end up using this to as an example to texture later on in the course. So that would be interesting to see how like this kind of came together as well. Um, and this is all done in Painter again. There's a lot of stuff. All the baking and everything was done, and all the kind of mesh maps and everything are done in Designer. But then the actual painting and the edgeware and all that kind of stuff, that's all done completely in Painter, which is the way. Yeah, like I said, is the way I kind of tend to work for assets like this now. But yeah, so like this is going to be sort of a scene. It's supposed to be like a robot kind of workshop, and the robot is like the main asset of the scene, obviously. But then it's going to have like a little diorama behind it with like, you know, like lots of wires and cables and like a workbench, and like kind of like he's at a service, and then he'd be operating on the robot. So then I made another sort of material for this scene, which is the brick material, which I'm going to kind of, again, this is something I'm probably going to use in the course to actually showcase how to start making textures and materials that are tiling. And yeah, so that I worked on that, and this was really like, I've been doing a lot of Substance Designer textures now, also sort of freelance things as well, with Substance with Substance Designer to do like tiling textures, just because like I've got into this side of like making tiling textures like a lot more recently, and it's just like actually really enjoy it. Like I think it's really fun, and it's quite it can be, you know, quite technical, but at the same time, like you do get a lot of artistic control when you've actually got past the technical side of things, which hopefully is what I'm going to kind of teach in the course, and I want to kind of get through the technical side of things to allow like you to make the artistic decisions, really, because that's what it's kind of about. Like once you know the technical stuff, then you shouldn't really be worried then. Like that's the biggest thing you have to kind of overcome when you start using new software, or you know, things like that. You get the technical side of stuff. Once you learn how to actually use the program, then you can focus on like, okay, how do I make awesome looking art? And then you're not kind of like, you know, held back then, or you can kind of do what you want. So yeah, so then this is going to look like a lot of text, but it's not. I'm just going to briefly explain it. So yeah, this is basically what's on the course, which is actually on the website anyway. But I'll just give you a very brief overview so you kind of know. So obviously the first week is kind of what we're doing now, so that's cool. So we're just going to go through like what I've kind of been talking about, and then we're going to have a quick run through of Substance Painter, Designer, like where everything lives, how to set projects up. That'll be sort of straight after this, basically. And then the next, so sort of week 2 and 3 is going back to this brick texture, is kind of like how to make that, pretty much. And then I'm going to sort of set, so it'll be homework for these kind of each week, but basically I'm going to set like projects to kind of recreate your own version of this. But then if you like, sort of with the option to go further if you want to, so you can kind of say like, oh well, this is cool, but like I want to do like, I don't know, like a different colored brick, or I want to do like, you can even like use the same techniques to do a completely different texture if you want to. So it's a bit it's quite flexible. Like if that's what you want to do, that's totally up to you. So yeah, we'll cover that, which is cool. So the first part is like the height map and how to handle getting the normal map, because that is actually the main body of the work for something like this. Doing the like the colors and the roughness and stuff, those are kind of like secondary. That's at least how I work. It doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, but that's my way of doing it. And I think if you look sort of have watched any other tutorials on substances things, you'll find that a lot of artists work like that. Like they'll do that height map thing first, and then they'll move on to the other textures. So yeah, so that's kind of how we're going to cover that. And then yes, part 2, so that's going to be like the roughness and the metallic and albedo. So yeah, so that's cool. And then the next week is texturing in asset. So to be honest, I mean, this week is like, I actually tend to use that technique more at work, but not so much in my personal work. But it's worth showing because it does kind of show like what you can do with Designer, not just making tileable textures, like you can texture an asset. So I'm probably just going to use an example of how to sort of like set up what the way I tend to work, is kind of like with base materials. So you'd have, say like a graph which applies like, if we go back to one of these example assets, so like with this there's like metal, and then like fabric and plastic and stuff. So how would you assign the different materials in Designer rather than doing it? You can do the same in Painter obviously, but how would you do it in Designer, and then how would you go through and do the extra added details as well? Because that actually, like, although this is really good, go back there, sorry, this is really good to texture in Painter like this. It, like in a production sense, like in video games, like it is a lot better to have like something that's going to be, you can sort of reuse for everything. So say I had this asset and I was really happy with the materials and everything, and I got everything set up, like, and then I do another asset for the scene, and I want that to have the exact same materials and things. Like in Designer, like you could set up a graph which every single time you like plug in a new model, it would automatically do all that for you. And that's a really good way to work, like in terms of a production sense, because then you're like, oh right, okay, I've got kind of, like the same consistency across everything, which is like, yeah, that's another good advantage of using Substance. So that's awesome. So yeah, we'll cover that in that week, and then the next week is basically doing the texturing in Painter. So like I said, probably going to end up using this just because it's like a really good example. It's got kind of lots of different materials on it, loads of different texture sets as well, and I did quite a lot of actual hand painting stuff on it as well. So that gives like, and I don't actually really tend to do a lot of that myself, because it's easier to rely on some of the more procedural stuff, and then I tend to like rely on procedural stuff and then add the unique detail if I feel like it's not working or I need to like paint it out or whatever. Like, but I tend to, like, you can, if it's a small asset, like you can get away with relying on the procedural stuff a little bit more, as long as you make sure that those mesh maps that you start with are really good. Then you'll end up with something like decent at the end, basically. So yeah, that's cool, and then kind of cover a lot of little techniques and details in Painter with that. So yeah, that'll be an interesting thing to sort of cover. So yeah, and then the final week is sort of taking the things that you made. So there'll probably be a texture from the first week, there'll be like another asset maybe, and then like the robot or whatever, and then like just setting that up in kind of like a presentation sense. So like how to put it into Marmoset and get everything looking good. I mean, you could do the same in Unreal as well if you wanted to, but I'm just going to use Marmoset just because it's quicker for me to showcase, at least at the end. So yeah, and then basically each week is kind of, I'm going to teach you kind of the techniques and things that I've learned, but then also it's a lot about like the thought processes. So I think that's the interesting side of things that you don't get from like necessarily like just doing stuff yourself. Like, it's really good to have these kind of watch these tutorials and learn like how the tools work, but then it's really nice to have like an artist say to you, okay, like this is what I was thinking at this time, I did this for this reason. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. That's kind of what I'm planning on doing. So yeah, anyway, so then we're just going to quickly touch on a bit of a sum up of Substance as well, because I think this is interesting to learn. Like, why do I use it? I think is a good question. So so on the one hand, you've got like on the left hand side, you've got like the way I used to texture, which was in Photoshop, and on the right is Substance, and you can kind of see like they're basically the opposites of each other. So when I was working in Photoshop, when I was sort of like at school or at university, sorry, and then when I first started in the industry, like it's very destructive. Like you kind of are making, like, you're adding layers, and then you have to, if you want to make a new texture, you got to copy all your layers, go through and edit and tweak and blah blah blah, all of that stuff. Whereas with Substance, you're working on the same thing, and even not just Substance, but even things like Quixel nowadays, like you're working on the same, like on all the channels at the same time. So if I make a gold material, I know that I've got like my roughness and everything is all working at the same time, and that's the powerful aspect of it, because it just saves you a lot of time. So yeah, and then like I sort of mentioned this briefly, when you're working in a production sense, like you can, if you've got some graphs that are texturing an asset, like I can send those over to another artist, they can use those, and like that iteration is going to be a lot easier in Substance, and we use that at work as well, and like I know that a lot of the artists find that very useful to do that. So yeah, that's kind of it. So that's just sort of a brief introduction, and now I'm kind of just going to jump straight into a little bit of Substance Painter and Designer. So I'll start with Designer just because that's the easiest one. So yeah, I'll give like a very quick overview to start with, just in terms of, let me just let's just close this and go for a completely new canvas. So when you first start, kind of this is what you're going to get. I mean, I've moved some stuff around in terms of the actual layout, so I can reset that back to like what it was originally. So this is what you'd get if you like started the program completely with nothing, like with nothing set up basically. So the first thing I kind of tend to do actually is, we'll just talk about layout. So your main sort of like window here, that's where your projects would be. So if you make a new project, that's the Explorer window, so you can find your stuff there. The library is where you kind of drag in different things. So you've got like, these are kind of like how you imagine sort of Photoshop noises. So you can drag those into your graph view and edit stuff there basically. And there's a load of different things in the library, and you can save your own things and add your own things to the library. Then the main sort of views that you'll always end up working with are the graph and the 2D and 3D views. So you'll end up, your graph view is basically where you do all your work. Your 3D view is where you view like the end result, and 2D view is where you view individual materials basically. And then the parameters is where, if you want to tweak things in the graph basically. So that's kind of the general layout. And then in terms of you can obviously resize windows and things like that, so that's pretty basic, like just dragging on these things, and the little buttons here will undock those, so you can move those around or like have them off screen. So for this, I'm going to keep everything on the same screen, because otherwise you won't have a clue what I'm doing. So but if you wanted to, if you had a double sort of screen setup or whatever, you can move stuff off. Like I tend to work with the 3D view off of like on another window, just because that's easier for me to see, and I get a bigger workspace. So like I always want to optimize like what's the biggest way of me having like the largest workspace basically. So that's why I would move things off. But what I tend to do generally is have, if I'm working kind of in one screen, I'd move like the 2D and 3D view together like this, and then have the graph. Actually, not even that necessarily. I'd probably because the 2D view is always square, or tends to be always square if you're working on square textures. So I move the 2D view to sort of like the side, so I can look at the texture in reference here. The library don't use that often, and also you can get a lot of the stuff in the graph view from it, so you don't need to actually use it very often. So I'd have the library and then the 3D view up here, just so I can work individually like that. So that's cool. So in terms of like setting up a new project, we'll cover that because that's the sort of first step. So when you first start, if you go File, like this is where you get all your substances from. So if you do new, you can do a new substance, you can open one. This is like where your recent ones are. You can save them and things like that. So if we do a new one, you get this window when you first make a new project, and the templates on the left hand side are kind of like depending on what you kind of want to do. So if you wanted to work in, like with PBR, you can either work in metallic and roughness or spec and gloss. So you could choose like which one of those you want. So we're going to work in this like for the most part basically, because it's what kind of Unreal supports, and it's easier to work with for me at least anyway, because I just find it faster. So yeah, I'm probably, in everything I do, I'm probably going to be selecting this template. And what the templates do is they put these outputs, so you've got these will be like your final textures, so your normal map, your roughness, metallic, and your base color. And then you see if you if you click on spec and gloss, you'll get different ones. So you've got your diffuse, normal, spec, and gloss. So it's very different, if to whatever, based on which one. So those are the outputs. Then in terms of settings for the graph, so you can give your graph a name. So I'm just going to call this like CGMA, like test or something like that. That's just easier then. So then that's the name. So you can, it doesn't even matter, you can make a new one and not worry about the name and name it later anyway, so it's not the end of the world. Then you have this option here, which you can kind of like find out if you type in, if you hold over it, like hover over it, tells you what it does. But excuse me, sorry, I just have a drink of water. That whole yeah. So relative to parent basically means that everything is controlled by the actual, like the oversizes of the graph. So you can kind of say like it will be like if you set the graph to be a certain size, every other node is relative to that. So like the parent is the graph basically. So if you set the graph size to like 2048, then all the other nodes in it will change basically. And then the other option is absolute. So that just means that if you set the value like to absolute, it's going to be that value, whereas like it won't sort of update. So you can change all this later anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So I tend to just I always leave this. I always like leave it relative to parent, and if I wanted to change it later, I do. So yeah, then I just hit OK, and that will give you a graph. So now you've got you've got a graph, you've got your view, whatever, and so we'll sort of cover how to do some very, very basic stuff very quickly. So one of the ways I tend to work is so you can hit spacebar, that will bring up okay, yeah, actually let's just cover this. So you've got the way the nodes work in Substance is you have like these main ones, which are the kind of ones, if you hit spacebar you can get to them. If you drag, you can drag them off of these little icons here as well. They're all the same, so you can see they kind of match up. And those are the ones that you will use like the most. And then the things in the library are like sort of more complicated stuff, I guess, like stuff that is not as common to use. So one of the things you can do is you can hit space and you can add them in. So I could add, I don't know, let's just say for example a uniform color. And yeah, so as a node setup, the same as say maybe Unreal. So you drag your thing and like plug it in basically to whatever, and then you can sort of delete the delete the node or its connection or whatever. So yeah, and you can see here actually, if we've just, this is really simple because all this is like a color basically. So like a Photoshop, like if you filled the layer with a color, that's basically what this is. And you can see here, and now actually this is quite useful. So if you click off of it, this will give you in the parameters like section, this will give you all the like settings for the graph itself. So here you can kind of see, if I sort of like, you see the nodes will change for the whole of the thing if I change this, whereas like if I'm changing this one, they're only changing for that node. So you basically, that's the thing you kind of have to get your head around. Like you have settings for the graph itself, and then you have settings for individual nodes. So clicking off of the node, like double clicking off, will give you settings for that. And this is where we'll cover this stuff later, but if you exposed a parameter, this is where you'll find that stuff. You can rename it, and it also covers things like tiling as well. So yeah, let's just have a look at the uniform color. So here you've got specific parameters. So I can always, these ones tend to be the same, the base parameters. So it's always resizing your like bit rate and like tiling and all that sort of stuff, and random seed, which is just like randomizes your parameter, whatever. And then for this is specific to that node. So here you can see like, and this is quite interesting as well. So your little yellow dot, your output, like when you're dragging your output into the input here, for example, you can see that this one is yellow. That basically means that it's color. And then where you've got one like this, it means it kind of accepts either color or grayscale. But the best way to think about this is like grayscale is a cheaper like the easiest way to work, and it's cheaper. When you want to introduce color, really, is basically when you're doing your normal maps and your base color. The other two ones, like metallic and roughness, are going to be grayscale anyway. So I personally would introduce that stuff later on, and then yeah, you can go back and change all this anyway. But like, so here you can see I can switch between color and grayscale. So if I choose grayscale, you can see how this like little thing updates. You've got like a node, the little orange thing to signify whether or not it's color or grayscale. And then here I can pick the color, so I can either click on that and it will give me a little thing, I can drag it around, whatever, or I can color pick, so I could pick off of this and get the color that I wanted. and then you'll see if I add this to here, you'll get that updated as your base color. So it's really simple, very simple stuff. One of the things I tend to use a lot actually, which is really useful, is if you hit space, you can actually, covers kind of another thing as well, you can search. So if I type in, I don't know, normal for example, I get like various things to do with normal maps. So what I actually use is a base material, so that's this one, and it looks like really complicated, but you just drag it on, and it's got a load of parameters, but it's basically a base node, and what's quite nice about it is it just gives you like a good starting point. So I can change, like there's so I can make this like not a metallic, so it's just a grayscale material, and I use this to preview, like when I'm starting working on things, at least when I'm doing tileables and things, I would use this. And then it's also got this nice option where you can expose your own texture. So if I'm like, obviously this has got just a base color, so I can change that color to be whatever I want. So if I wanted like a red plastic, I could, go for red plastic, and then I can go in the roughness, and I can tweak those like settings, so I could make that sort of really matte, or I can go for like glossy like material. So yeah, that's really simple stuff. But basically what's nice about this node is you can click on these user defined maps. So if I click on base color, you'll see that it gets like a little input that appears. So if I then went and added what we did before, so if I have a uniform color, obviously this isn't going to be a uniform color when I finish. Say I'm doing like concrete or whatever, it might be like a lot more complicated, but that's now taking whatever that input is, and that's the same for anything. So I can do any of the maps. So I'll use this later, this will become a lot clearer later, but basically it's just to kind of show that you can have like a really simple base material, just as to set up, and then you can plug your own stuff into it. It's just good for previewing, that's what I found anyway, and I use that so that, and it also generates your normal map. So if you wanted to just have your height map going into it, it would give you your normal map. And so that sort of stuff is really good. And I actually, one of my friends told me about this recently at work, and I ended up making something equivalent, like the same sort of node, and then realized like, oh, you actually have this. And this has got a load more settings than the one I made anyway. So yeah, that's kind of that. So that kind of sort of covers those things. So now we'll just have a very quick look at viewport things. So like the 3D view is probably where you want to change most of your settings. So the geometry tab is like if you wanted to change to a different like model to view your things on. So they've got a load of presets, but then if you had your own one, you can drag it and drop it into the viewport, and it will view update, which I'll show that later as well. Materials is where you edit a lot of settings. If I was working with a tileable texture, I go into that to change those. Excuse me. So yeah, if you click on default and then edit, you'll get the various stuff there for those things. So it allows you to change the emissive. The height is one that I always end up using, because you can use a parallax, and when you're actually at sort of working on like something with a height map and a normal map, it's really nice to be able to see like the depth. It's almost like I tend to use it like it's almost like I'm sculpting something in ZBrush if I'm working on a texture. So we'll cover that as well. Then the other thing is, let me just find something so I can show you an example of this. So if I just get a random noise, we'll plug that in. So it's going to look horrible, but it doesn't really matter. It's just to illustrate the point. So here you've got this tiling option, which I don't think many people actually know about, just because it's kind of hidden away, but it's really useful because when I was working, I used to like use transform nodes. So in here you've got transform 2D, which is basically just you can change the amount of tiling. So you can say like add these values in here to to like tile it more basically, or even less, or whatever you want to do basically. So you can see how that's kind of changing the little box here and how much it's tiling. But in here, like having that sort of option actually to just tile it in the actual material itself is so handy, because it means you don't have to change anything. So you can type in a value like 2, and you know that just to see, like, it's good when you're working because you want to be able to like preview like a tiling texture in it, and it's nice to be able to say, oh, are these bits like, do they look really obvious, or is it definitely tiling right, and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's really useful to have that option. So I do actually use that quite a lot. So yeah, and then the rest of the stuff, I mean, cameras and lights, like if you're doing renders and things, are kind of useful, I guess. The environment one is good because you can turn off the background, and that's nice. I probably would do that just because it means you can focus on what you're working on a little bit easier. Um, so yeah, I kind of like that one, and I'm working on that. So that's nice. And then yeah, you can rotate it as well, which you can. I think you can do. There's a shortcut to do that, which is Control Shift and right mouse. Oh, actually, is it? Um, yeah, Control, because that's pan. Yeah, so Control Shift and right mouse will do the rotation. You see it's updating, and you can change the exposure as well. Um, and then you can do various things like wireframe and all that kind of stuff in display. And then the render is like, I may end up using that later just to do like maybe a render of the material and see, like, but you can switch between using like the iRay renderer, which is really useful as well, to use. So yeah, that kind of covers the basics, very very basic stuff that I've kind of covered here. So now I'm just going to show you how to do some baking, like how to bake your materials as well, because that's something that we'll need later. So I'm probably going to end up providing you with some models and things, so that's fine. But like to actually yeah, if you're going to do your own work, it's nice to know how to actually get that working. So yeah, the way you get models into it, so you can import if you right click on the graph, you get a load of options. So you can save the project, export and publish things, and then you can link stuff. So that's one of the things that's basically how you do your baking. So if you right click link 3D mesh, you'll get a pop-up window, and then you can choose sort of locate to where your mesh is. So I'm going to choose mech, and then I'm going to choose the arm, just as an example. So I've got the high poly there and the low poly, and then a version where they're kind of combined. So I'll just add those in, and you can kind of see what that kind of looks like. So then that will create a folder there called resources, and that will contain those things. So I'm just going to save as well, actually, while we're here. So right click, save as, and then you can save that wherever you want to. So I'm just going to overwrite this one that I'd already sort of made earlier. So yeah, now obviously you got your low poly, so I can drag, like I said before, you can drag those in. So this is an exploded version of the model, and then I've got like the high version, which will take a little bit longer to load if you drag that in, and a complete version where the model's kind of like finished basically. So yeah, I'm going to right click. So when you right click on a model, you get the sort of various options. So you can open the model, like delete it and stuff like that, and reload it and refresh it and stuff. If the reference is broken, you can actually find where it lives, which is really cool, and relocate it if the link breaks. And then, so the one you want if you're baking is bake model information. So that will give you a pop-up box, and you'll probably have something like this when you first start. So there will be nothing kind of in the baking section, and that tells you the model and how many faces and whatever, but like information basically about the model. So the first thing you want to do is choose your folder actually on the right hand side where you want these textures to be saved when they bake. So as I'm using this sort of CGMA kind of folder just to illustrate. So the way I kind of lay out my stuff is I tend to have a textures folder. So I'll add like any textures I've got to the model, and then maybe like let's make a baking kind of folder, or let's just bakes is fine. And you can just hit select folder, and that will update that reference, and anything that you spit out as a result of it baking, that will go in there. So yeah, you can choose to override ones that already exist in that folder, or make new ones basically as well. And then this will, in here, you can choose to link or embed it into the project itself. So when it bakes, it will chuck everything out in the same folder underneath the Explorer window. So you can choose to have that actually like linked in there, so that like if that updates, it refreshes, or you can actually save it in the project itself. Um, so the first thing I'd probably do is like if you hit the baker's like plus button, you can choose what map you want. So I would probably just bake a normal map normally, just to check like everything's working. That's always the way I tend to work. So when you chuck a normal map in, you get options which govern the whole of the maps, and then ones that are actually individual to that particular thing. So you can choose a size. So we'll just choose something small because it's at that state. Like when you're testing and stuff, you don't want to go through a big process of waiting for everything to bake really quickly. So then you've got underneath here, when you're doing your normal map, you can choose your high mesh. So you can either choose that from a file. So if I click to file, I could locate to wherever it is in the folders, or I can choose from resource. Because I've already linked it in the project, I'm going to do that. And then you can select the high poly, and you'll notice now that you've got a little green tick to say that you can bake that. And it's basically, if anything's going wrong, you kind of look at this one here where it's like choosing to bake to, because sometimes it won't recognize the path, or you look at the mesh and check that that's working. And then you have options for your baking, so you can do a cage, or you can change. So this is going to just be raycast because I've exploded it, so I don't really need to worry about cages. And you can also do things like matching. Substance has a way of baking where you can, if you've got your high poly and low poly named the same, you can bake everything not exploded. But I mean, I just did an exploded one because it was quicker for me, because there's not that many pieces. So yeah, it was easier, but it doesn't really matter. You can kind of choose those options, and you can, if you've got your own cage as well, you can add that in. So yeah, then if you just hit OK, that will bring up a little dialogue, which will go through the baking, and then you'll see it finished basically. So we'll just give that a couple of seconds, and I'll leave this actually running in real time so you guys can get an idea of how long it takes. It's normally pretty speedy. I mean, this is only 512, so yeah, you can see that's done. It's quite fast. And then it spat out a normal map for that model. So I've got the arm in here, so if I can use this base material thing as well actually. So we'll turn off, we'll put in normal map. So now if I plug that in to there, and then we'll change, let's make this not red because we don't want red. So now you can see it's not really appearing on the model. If you right click in the graph and do view outputs, that will update and everything will go in there. So that's updated, that's baked. You can see it's pretty crappy resolution, but that's only because it's 512. But you can kind of see already, like with that, like if I was getting errors, or if the baking wasn't working right or whatever, like I could go in now and figure that out at 512 and rebake, and whatever I need to do to kind of ensure that I've got like a nice clean model, I guess. So yeah, that's kind of covers basic baking. So and then actually what I would tend to do now I've done that, which save this. Now I've baked the normal map, is I'd go back and I'd add more maps. So I'd go, okay, I want ambient occlusion, I want curvature, I want world space, and we'll cover what ones you need later. But like that would be my process. I normally just tend to get my normal map, make sure everything's working, because all the rest of those maps kind of are driven off of a normal map anyway. So if there's errors in your normal map, then you know there's going to be errors in the other ones. So you might as well just get your normal map looking good to start with, and then yeah, work on that. So yeah, that kind of covers a very basic introduction to Designer, and kind of how things work there. So now I'm going to jump into Substance Painter and just give you a quick overview of that, and that will kind of wrap up our first lesson really. And we'll sort of start next week mainly in Designer. But I mean, I'm probably for this lesson, there's not really going to be any sort of specifically set homework, but what I would kind of do is just have a play around in the programs, get used to how everything works, and like make a couple of projects and work out how to actually use things. And there are a couple of Substance, like you can download some stuff off Substance Share. Actually, let's just quickly have a look at that, because it's kind of useful to know. So if we go Substance Share, so this is like a website where you can download existing resources. So you can download materials here. So there's a couple of textures and things. It's worth, like, if you just wanted to have a look at some graphs and things, you can get a few things off of there. Just as an example, just have a look. Some of them will be complicated, but it doesn't matter too much. Just to see how things are laid out and things really, um, and sort of how things come together, and then we'll cover like how to make a texture like in the next episode. Mm. So yeah, that's quite a good platform to have a look at that stuff if you wanted to work out how to set things up. So the reason I mentioned that is because I was going to say that there's some example files for Substance Painter. So if you wanted to get the same for Designer, then you can. So they have a little preview sphere in here, and there's also some other stuff you can download off the Substance Share for Painter. Some like models and things actually. Let's see if I can find back to that. So tutorials. Yeah, some of the tutorials. Okay. So these aren't loading, but these, yeah. Oh, here you go. These are some example models for Painter which you can download. I think a lot of them actually are in Algorithmic's like example tutorials and things, like if you've ever had a look at any of those. But you can download, so like the this one is like a good example, like if you wanted to go through and like see how they set up their projects and materials and things. So yeah, you can download a couple of those, like just to have a look. That's probably what I would advise anyway for the first week, just because we'll get into more serious kind of homework assignment stuff like over the next few weeks when I've actually been setting, like, because this is obviously the first week. You just want to kind of give you an overview. The next like weeks are going to be like jump straight in basically and start working. So yeah, that's kind of that. So we'll just we'll look at Substance Painter now. So yeah, general layout wise, I tend to actually keep the layout pretty similar to what the default. So this is the default layout. I tend to keep it pretty similar, just because they've got some nice. You can make it like the main viewport full screen anyway. So if you want to look at stuff in full screen, it's really easy. Whereas unlike sort of Designer where you kind of have your separate windows, this is a little bit more. Excuse me. A little bit more, yeah, kind of easier to work with in terms of actually, like working on your model and like previewing it in a bigger sort of mode. So it works in the same way. Like you go file, you can do a new project, and then there's quite a lot of tools in here. So I'll give you a very quick overview, brief kind of. So in terms of, we'll talk about layout first. So your shelf is where like sort of your main anything to do with like alphas and textures and things are saved. So you can see like these are all alphas for brushes and things like that. You've got generators and some of the same noises that you get in Designer. So you would have seen that earlier, but yeah, those are very similar, like procedural sort of noises and things that you can add in. Generator, we'll sort of touch on that stuff in a bit. Textures, like themselves, like they've added in the new versions, they've added a load of sort of normal map details, which are quite useful. And then if you import your own textures, you'd see them here. And then filters and various other stuff, basically. Then this is where your main kind of tool sets are. So brushes, basically, in here. Particle brushes, which are like where you can do sort of drips and things like that. And then tools, which are kind of like stamps, basically, so you can chuck a screw and bolt on your mesh or whatever. Then the main area that I tend to use quite a lot is the actual material. So you've got base materials here, which you kind of assign to your model. You've got smart ones, which are like a group or layer of materials that like are based off of mesh maps and things. And then you've got smart masks, which are, again, these are new for the new Substance. Then over to the right hand side is where you kind of control anything to do with the actual project, so texture, sets, and anything to do with the display settings and all that kind of stuff. Layers is where you, like sort of Photoshop, you add your actual layers, and then any settings are on the right hand side, basically. So we'll actually open a sample file, because that would be easy to work with. And you guys can then do the exact same thing if you wanted to sort of like follow along. So yeah, that will hopefully open. There we go. Yeah. So when you open this, I think it just has one of the materials assigned to it. Yeah. So I think it's one of the smart materials. Yeah, it's this bronze armor one. So we'll get rid of that. We don't need that for now. So in here, basically, we'll give a very quick overview. So this texture set settings is where you find all the project settings. So this is where you can set the size of the project. So we can go 1024 and it will resize 512, whatever. So you can work. What I tend to do is work at a low resolution, and then up res at the very end, because everything works. It kind of knows the history for all your stroke patterns and everything. It's very easy to just like sort of like change anything at any time. This is where this is basically how your outputs worked in Designer. So you've got the different, like the color, height, roughness, metallic, like the final maps. You can add them as well. So if you wanted to add ambient occlusion, or you wanted to add a emissive texture, or any of those things, you can add that like with a little plus button. These are settings to do with your normal maps, and then you can bake textures in Designer as well. So that actually works very like in the same way. So if you bring that dialog up, you'll get it. It doesn't in Designer. You can use a high res map, and you can bake some textures with just the normal map. You can't actually do that in Painter. So you can't bake like an ambient occlusion without using a high res mesh, for example. So you see how it's got this exclamation mark. Like that basically means you need like a high res model, like a high definition mesh in there to actually bake that information, which is fine if you've got all of that. So yeah, and this you've got like all the settings for that. So common settings are the settings that apply to all the model, like all the textures it's baking, and then individual ones like per whatever the actual like mesh is basically. And then this is where this stuff gets plugged in. So if you baked in Painter, that automatically would put those meshes when you bake in there. I'm not going to do that, I don't think, for my projects, because I like to have a little bit more control over what's going in these. So I will work on those in Designer and then bring them in anyway. So yeah, then you've got your settings for your display. So you can this was all kind of rendering stuff. You don't need to worry too much about that. But you can add like post effects like anti-aliasing and tone mapping, depth field, all that sort of stuff. And then viewer settings is pretty useful. So you can see like the environment map. So if you drag the opacity of the environment map up, you can see that in the background, and then it's got like blurs on. So whatever this default environment map is in there. So I, again, like same as before, I would probably tend to work with it off. Just because it's a bit distracting. It's nice to be able to see it. You've also got shadows, so I tend to these can be a little bit annoying to work with as well, because they're sort of always refreshing. You see it kind of like flickers a little bit, so I tend to work with those off, and then if I want to preview shadows, I'll probably just turn them on. And then you've got settings for like ambient occlusion and per your shader. So in here is what shader you're using. So if you wanted to switch, if you want to go work in spec and gloss, there's various there you go, there's spec and gloss shaders and various other different ones if you want to look at those basically. But because we're gonna stick with metal and roughness, we're just gonna stay with that for most of the time, so probably won't be changing that. You can also turn on your wireframe as well and change color, so that's kind of a nice thing to be able to do. This is a very high res mesh for previewing anyway. So yeah, and then in terms of the rest of the viewport, so the layers is where you're probably going to do a lot of most of the work, obviously. So I'm just going to cover what these things do on the right hand side. So anything to do with layers and materials is on this little bit here. So you can add a blank layer, which will allow you to then, you can see I've got a brush, just the default brush, so you can paint into that layer, and whatever's in that layer then is contained in that layer. So you can turn layer on and off the same as you can in Photoshop. This is where you control the blend modes, and then this is the opacity, so I can drag that. And then this is individual per map, so you can change, you can drop from the drop down, you can choose your color, or you can choose your height and affect the opacity and stuff like that. So I'll be doing a lot of that sort of stuff later anyway. So then just for general previewing terms as well, so if you press M on the keyboard, you get, that's the full material, and it's kind of all of its maps. If you press C, you can cycle between the channels, so you can see here in the base color it's painted in white, it's painted in black in the height, a grey color in the roughness, and metallic is black, yeah. So, and then an M to go back. So yeah, that kind of covers that. So that's a blank layer, and then there's delete kind of self-explanatory. Yeah, obviously I'm kind of going through this quite fast, so if you wanted to kind of go back at this and understand this a little bit, but I'll try and just give you a quick overview. So yeah, then so blank layer here fill layer, which is basically what we were saying about before. So this allows you to choose like one of these materials. So you can see I can just click between these. And that's the great thing about Substance Painter, is that you can go back and change things like at any point. So I could work on this like metallic-y material and then say, oh, actually, well, I didn't really want it to be copper, I kind of wanted it to be gold. So then, and you've always got that, you can always go back in the layers, and it's pretty non-destructive. Like, you can just, yeah, change those settings at any time, so that's great. And then you've got smart materials, which is, like I said before, is a collection. So if we chose like the bronze armor, which was one, you can drag and drop from here, or you can add smart material here. I actually find it easier to do this just because I know what I'm choosing then. So that basically, if you have a look at that, that kind of covers what this button does here as well. So the folder is exactly the same as like a group or whatever in Photoshop, so you can add, like, group together your materials. So if you click that button there, you expand the group and see what's in. So I can actually go down through the layers, turn them all off, work out, okay, well, what's going on in this one. So it's like a base color with various different things. Like, I can turn these things off as well and work out like how they've constructed like the material basically. So that's really nice to be able to do that in all the layers, and with the existing stuff that is it actually in Painter. So yeah, I tend to work like that in a lot of ways actually, because I'll go in and I'll say I chose this material here, like this base material is like a decent sort of like metal, dirty kind of like bronze metal. If I was like using this and I was like, oh well, I really like this, but I'm not that I don't really want, like, I don't really want those scratches in there, I can kind of take those scratches out and use that as a base. And that's what's so good about, like I said before, is you can go and change anything. So if I wanted to make this, like, I really like this material, but I don't want it to be, I don't want it to be a metal, like I want it to be plastic, I can go and change, like go in and tweak like these settings here, take the metal out, like add, edge wear that's like a bit, so I'm already, even just from like changing a few of those settings really quickly, I've got like a completely different material, but it's still using like the same kind of bronze base basically. So you'll find like you'll be able to do that really easily, and I work in a lot of those ways, because I'll use like a base material and say, okay, well, I'm really happy like with what that looks like, but like with a few tweaks I can get it looking exactly like what as sort of like the material that I'm after. And I find that it's good to work from a base, and then like you can tweak and add stuff, and you'll probably see me do that a lot like later on anyway. So yeah, that kind of covers like that side of the material stuff. Then the next part is anything to do with masks and kind of like detail stuff basically. So in the edit layers, that kind of covers stuff. So you can duplicate the layer, you can group it together, you can cut and paste it basically, and then you can turn it into a smart material. So say I wanted to do, like, I quite like this as a, I don't know, let's just rename it to like worn plastic or something. I'll just go that. So then say that I'm like really happy with that and I want to use that like material again and save it into the library. You can hit create smart material, and that will put that into that area. But you can also, if you right click on stuff, you get a lot of the options that you get from these menus as well. So you can do the same here as well, like create with smart material. So if I do that now, you'll see it populates the smart materials with like worn plastic there. So now if I get rid of this, drag this back in, I've got that material there. So I can go in now and use that worn plastic wherever I want to, or on any other model. Like if I go into a new project, I can drag that on. So that's really powerful as well. So that's cool. Then in terms of masks, this is like the next bit that's kind of a little bit more sort of complicated. If you want to build up like various stuff together, like these smart materials will use it, but we'll use a really simple example. So we're just going to do like a little material with so we'll start with just an aluminium metal, because it's like really shiny, super obvious, and then we'll add like a plastic one sort of like over the top. So we've got plastic matte, and then we've got this one underneath. So if you add a black mask, so you click on this little button here, click black mask, that will mask out the blue material, as you could probably guess. And then a white mask would reveal it. So that's really simple. Then you've got the option to add your own mask, so you can bring in a texture, or you can mask with like color IDs. So that's like if you baked out a color map. This project doesn't have one, I don't think. No, it doesn't. So, but if you did, like I'll show you. I'll probably end up showing you that a bit later. But you can add a mask, so you can mask like the plastic into the sections that you wanted to have the plastic on, basically. And then you can also view the mask by alt clicking. So if you alt click on it, that will view the mask itself as well. So we'll make a mask in a second and we'll see. So you can paint into those masks as well. So like if I don't know, choose, you can see that like I'm revealing like the metal underneath when I'm painting. So I'm painting like black into that mask like now. If I so I can paint whatever I wanted to paint into this, like, and that's going to reveal like whatever is underneath that mask. So you can clear the mask, invert the mask as well, and then export the mask like to a file. That's really useful because like if you wanted to go and hand edit it, or you wanted the mask for another project or whatever, it's really useful to be able to have that sort of stuff. So that's really good. So yeah, I'm just going to set that back to black. Now, in this section here, like with the effects, so obviously you've got your masks here, and then you've got your effects. Like the effects are stuff you have to kind of, so you can add them. You'll see that like I can click between mask and I can click between material. You can add some things, like some effects and some generators you can actually add directly to the material itself, and some you have to add to a mask. So generators are actually the same section that live in this shelf here, so you can see here. So you can either like drag and like drop those in, or you can just click this button here and choose from that list. So you'll see here like you've got, these exist also in Substance Designer, sorry, as well. But you can click on these different things to sort of reveal various areas of the mask. So with the edgeware, so if I say edgeware as an example, if I click that, that will bring in edgeware. And we'll just invert that, so we've got the metal edgeware there. So you can see like how that's working. I can alt click to see what the mask is doing basically. But what's cool is like these things are like substances, so you can go in, you can see what it's using to generate this mask. So it's using the different inputs that actually exist within the texture sets, and then you've got all these parameters. So I can change like if I drag this in real time, you're getting like how much like wear is coming through basically from that mask, and like how much I can dial, like how much grunge is there. So yeah, that's basically how like I'm going to set up quite a lot of my material. So I'm going to use generators and I'm going to use smart masks. So the difference between the two is like the generators are like how we have materials and smart materials. So materials are like a group of smart materials, sorry, are a group of like materials with various settings and different generators and things like that. And that's kind of what a smart mask is. So a smart mask is the same. It's like a generator is like a base one, like a material, and then a smart mask is like lots of different ones together that are kind of like have been, you know, like they've been made from the mask generator basically. So in here, if you have a generator, you've got like there's some base ones, but the mask editor and the builder, those are sort of like to make your own ones, and this is how the smart masks are often made. So they're like a collection of different ones, so you can add them here. So you can find like there's quite a lot of cool different ones in here. So if you typed in edge, you've got like edge damages, and like let's choose like edge uber. So I can drag that onto the mask there, and you'll see like if I invert that, that's like got its sort of, it's been made there from the mask editor, and it's got its own settings that have been set like for that particular like mask basically. So it gives you like there's loads of they're basically presets, so you can go through and choose like you know, a load of presets for how you want like your masks to be affected. So that's kind of that. So now we'll cover the other ones. So paint allows you to just paint into like the actual mask. So that's quite useful when like obviously you could just paint into the mask there, but it's quite useful if you wanted to like add to a mask. So if you say you've added this, actually we'll just explain that. So there's a fill which allows you to put in a texture itself. So like if we go back to these like noises, you can add a noise in. You can see that that's filling that mask with that noise. So it's like a kind of, yeah, like if you added that as like a layer basically, and then that's filling the color that you've got there with that actual noise. And then you've got your own set. Again, the noises are procedural, so they've got their own settings. So I can like change the settings for this mask and like change the contrast and disorder and stuff like that, just as I could like if I was editing this in Designer. Like I've got the same settings basically. And then like say I'm really happy with that, but then I'm not, like I want to paint some sections out, I can add this paint. Oh, I can add to it, sorry, like, and I can get rid of it. But like it's nice to be able to kind of go in and individually like add to it or take away from it basically on top. So then because like if I try and do that in the mask now, you can see that that doesn't let me do that, whereas the paint is that way of doing that basically. And then levels is like kind of self-explanatory. Like it's exactly the same as it is in, it's like the same as it is in Photoshop or in Designer. And you can see actually now like you're getting an idea. Like I can stack these things up. So like, and they've got blend modes on them as individual things as well. So if I wanted to like, you know, subtract that or you know, add, multiply, whatever, those kind of things, like you can do that in individual kind of effects as well. So yeah, that's pretty much covers that stuff. I mean, this will all, I mean, I'm going through it quite quickly, but this will all come into a lot more sense and a lot more context when I actually show an asset. But it's just to kind of give a brief sort of overview. So that kind of covers all of the kind of like bottom half bit and this side. So I will just do what's in the kind of top sections. So depending on what version you're on, hopefully you guys can be on like Substance Painter 2, because otherwise none of this is going to make a lot of sense to you. So in Substance Painter 1, like if you've got that version, you probably just won't have smart masks basically, because that was the newer side of things. And then a few of these tools up here you won't have. So the tools themselves, like these two buttons are to do with sharing, so you can add them to that. So the Substance Share website thing that I showed you earlier, that is that here you can add stuff to that basically. That allows you to add things and like download stuff. And then these are all your tools. So you've got brushes, which we kind of sort of explained. The eraser, so you can actually just, you know, erase stuff out. Projection is like stamping and things. Your polygon fill is really useful actually, so we'll just quickly show you that. It's kind of handy to have. I use this actually quite a lot, surprisingly. So if you click on that, you'll get, on your properties over here, you get a little box where you can choose. So you can select via, like, it's basically a way of masking stuff. So you can select like elements like you can in, say, Max or Maya or whatever, and like add them to the mask, or you can choose them like based on like UV shell, for example. Like, so this would be like depending on how it's unwrapped. And then you can add actually individual faces as well. So you can select, like, if you want to go in and like pick these faces here and add that color there, you can drag and select those basically, and that's adding those faces. So I don't tend to use the faces one unless I want like in a really specific example, but I use the element like a lot to select, like, I want this piece to be a new material. And if I haven't made, like, if I haven't done that in the in like a sort of color selector thing, it can be really useful to do that sort of stuff. So yeah, I tend to use that a lot. Then there's a smudge and clone tools. Those are like new things in Substance Painter. So you can like sort of smudge, like I'm like smudging the mask here, but you can see like it works the same as like the smudge brush would do in Photoshop. I don't really tend to use that just because, I mean, it's pretty cool, it looks cool, but I just like, I don't do much like hand painted stuff, as I said, so it doesn't really come much into kind of stuff that I end up working on anyway.
But you know, like if you guys want to do something that's a bit more like hand painted, then it kind of would be very useful. Clone tool I haven't actually found a use for yet, but um, again, like you can just pick and sample, and it clones like what you've kind of selected. I just haven't found a use for it yet, but I'm sure I will. And then material picker is kind of the same, so I can say I want this material, and it will select that material. All the settings for symmetry. And this changes, actually this is a good point, I haven't really touched on this. So you can change between different viewports. So if I want, like at the moment I'm in 3D view. If I choose, I can choose 2D, so that's my UV sets. So like you can alt and right click to zoom out, and then you can, actually when you bring up, if you press those buttons, it will give you what each thing does. Rather than me explain everything, it's a bit easier if you just hold those, you can see what's happening there. Then I can view the UVs, which is kind of useful because if you wanted to paint like in straight lines, like I'm not going to be able to do that very easily on the UVs. On the 3D mesh. So it's cool if you've got the flat UVs to do that as well. So I can view those two things at the same time, or I can look at 3D. To be honest, I tend to work in 3D a lot of the time. There'll be a couple of occasions where I use the like UVs, but I'll just go straight back to 3D anyway. So yeah. And then the rest of the stuff is like there's an orthographic mode now as well. So if you wanted to paint like from the side view or whatever, if you're in perspective, then like that's not going to be very easy. Whereas you can switch between those things basically. And then again, this is the same thing, iRay, as in Designer. And then you've got a lazy mouse, which is the same as there's one in ZBrush, but it just allows your flow of your brush to be, nice and smooth, basically. So yeah, that kind of covers as like a very brief overview of Painter. So yeah, if you guys like have any questions or you want to ask me anything, then obviously you can send me emails or things like that. But yeah, so just as a summary. We've kind of gone through how to sort of set up projects in the different things, how to bake some stuff, and the general overview of the UI and everything for the different programs. So next week we will look at doing the first part actually of the material. So we're going to set up like the height map for the brick pattern. Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, so that will be we'll cover sort of like how to go from the start to making the actual finished kind of height map. And like I said, I'll probably start setting some like proper homework from that week onwards. So it will be how to cover the actual how to cover like how to actually set up the material, and potentially like if you wanted to go further with it or you want to choose your own one, then you can do that as well. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility, and then I'll be giving sort of like feedback on those materials. So if once you've made them and you want to know how to improve them, or like that you're stuck on a particular aspect or whatever, then we can kind of cover that stuff as well. So yeah, okay, cool, right, so that's all sorted. So yeah, I'll see you guys next week. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and look forward to seeing you next week. Cheers.